This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So, as Manjushri said, we've been looking at this lecture of Bhante. So I'll refer to Sangharakshita as Bhante. So Bhante is a kind of an honorific title, so it means something like precious teacher. And he was the founder of our order and movement. And we've been talking about this lecture that he gave in 1980. And it's called The Taste of Freedom. So this is the old edition of the book. I recommend, I don't know if this is still in print actually, but it's a fantastic edition. It's got 3 wonderful lectures in there. But if you can't get hold of that, we've just reprinted the Taste of Freedom lecture. So, as Manjushri was holding up. So, as Manjushri said, that's what we've been looking at over the last few weeks. And last week we had Jnanavacha. It's very good. I was appreciating Manjushri's introduction because it means I don't sort of have to give a whole introduction to what we've been talking about and so on. So I'll just get straight in there. So last week Jnanavacha was talking about the first Fetter. And I was on the phone to my sister earlier on, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing this evening?" I said, "I'm teaching at the Buddhist Centre." And she said, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Oh, the third Fetter." And she said, "What, like the cheese?" So my sister's, obviously very interested in Buddhism and very supportive of what I'm doing. I said, "Yes, that's right. I'm going to give a talk on cheese." Yeah. So we'll start off talking about Fetter. Obviously, then we'll go on to Idam, Gouda, that sort of thing. So obviously, it's not that, is it? I'm not going to talk about Fetter in that sense. But it is. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Fetter, F-E-T-T-E-R. It's quite an antiquated word in a sense. It's not a word that you hear in common parlance. So I thought I would look it up in the dictionary. I looked it up in the dictionary, and it says it's something like a manacle or a chain. So it's, as Manjushri said, it's something that binds us, and apparently often to the ankle. So it's a manacle or chain that often goes around the ankle. But in the Buddhist sense, it's something that binds us to our state of suffering, really, to what we call samsara, which is our everyday sort of worldly human consciousness, which is characterized by unsatisfactoriness, by craving, by aversion, wanting things, pushing things away, never quite really getting to a life of complete fulfillment that is permanent. And the word for freedom, so when Bhante talks about, in the lecture, he's talking about freedom, and the word for freedom, Jnanavacha mentioned this last week. Does anybody remember what it is? So Bhante uses the Pali word, which is vimutti. So I think vimukti is the Sanskrit version. But Bhante uses the word vimutti. So it's vimutti. And he makes the point, which is very, very important, which is what we're concerned with is what he's concerned with in the lecture, and what we should concern ourselves with is vimutti. So it's not freedom, or it's freedom in the sense of vimutti, but not vimutti in the sense of freedom. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Yeah? So it's not a direct translation. Freedom is as close as we can get to what vimutti means. But the actual phrase is vimutti. So that's what the Buddhist phrase is. That's what the term is that we're talking about. And this is important because freedom, one of the reasons why it's important is because freedom has all sorts of other connotations. So as Jnanavacha was discussing last week, when we think about freedom, what do we think about? What would you say characterizes freedom in our sort of current everyday London life or society? What does that bring to mind? Yeah? Choice, yeah, that's right. So choice is one thing. So we think that if we have a choice, that always, to have choice is to have freedom. That's true. Yeah. I don't think it is true, by the way, but it's true what you're saying, that's, yeah. Anyone else? What do we think of when we think of freedom? Money. Yeah. So things like, choice, money, fame, whatever it is, we have these ideas about things that are going to make us feel free. And actually that's not vimutti. Vimutti is much, much, much more, is much deeper than that. Well, to start off with, it is genuine freedom, so it will genuinely bring us freedom, and freedom that will last and will be permanent. It's interesting, that thing, isn't it, of translations. So I think it's very, very important in general in studying the Dharma is to always remember that when we talk about these phrases, whether if we're using Pali or Sanskrit, words like dukkha, which gets translated as unsatisfactoriness or suffering, it's not what we translate it as. It's not going to be an exact translation. I think it's very interesting. Like I've been trying to learn Hindi over the last couple of years because my work takes me to India quite a lot. So I spend 2 or 3 months of the year in India, and I've been learning a bit of Hindi. So I speak a bit of Bengali anyway, just a very small amount. But I've been learning Hindi, and it's very, very interesting, isn't it? When you learn another language, what you realise is you're not actually saying the direct equivalent of something in your own language. When I learn a word in Hindi, it's not a direct, it doesn't directly equate to the word in English. In India it's fantastic because you even have gestures that don't have a direct equivalent, So the most useful one when I'm in India is this one, when people go like that, and it means sort of like yes and no at the same time and maybe and, and I found myself doing that lately, and you can actually really do that. It's sort of in its own language, But anyway, I'm digressing. So the thing with the fetters is it's not. I think it's a useful image. This image of being chained or manacled, because that's not our natural state. So actually, our potential as human beings is this freedom, is vimutti. So it's not a literal concept. And in the tradition, the actual fetter, the way it's described in the tradition, is attachment to rites and religious observances as ends in themselves. So I'll say that again: attachments to rites and religious observances as ends in themselves. So I, for one, am very grateful that Bhante sort of unpacks this for us, because when I first came across this teaching, I just sort of thought, what does that actually mean? Attachments to rites and rituals as ends in themselves. I didn't really know what it meant. And Bhante describes this as the fetter of superficiality, and I find that very, very helpful. So he talks about the fetter of superficiality, and I'm going to be saying a bit more about what that means. So the first thing to say is that what it means is that we act in a superficial way. So because we haven't broken this fetter, we act in a superficial way. So we act from the surface of ourselves, and Bhante says we act without thoroughness or care. I think that's very interesting, isn't it? We act without thoroughness or care. We act from the surface of ourselves, and he says we don't act from the whole of ourselves. So we act from the intellect, but not from our emotional depths. So just have a think about what that means for a moment. It's almost like, actually, I'll just say what Bhante says about it. So he says, it's like, we're acting from the intellect, but there's these depths which we can't quite bring on board. We can't quite marry up those two aspects of ourselves. So what I want to start off talking about is why that happens. And Bhante talks about why this happens. And I can see you're all really curious. You want to know why. Why, Akashamitra? Why does this happen? Well, Bhante says it's because we are divided, basically. We're not united in our purpose or our way of thinking about things, so we don't act with the whole of ourselves. And he's quite strong on this, actually. He says for that reason we don't really act at all. So we're divided, and we don't really act at all. He says we don't truly, authentically do anything. And the consequence of this is that we don't get very far, we don't grow, and we don't develop. So while we have this sort of divided self, while we're sort of divided in our aims, it's interesting, in the lecture he talks about a historian called Matthew Arnold, who was writing about 100 years ago. And this historian, Matthew Arnold, he talked about our divided aims and our sick hurry. That's what he talked about, our divided aims and our sick hurry. And that's interesting, isn't it? That he was writing over 100 years ago, and yet that could very well describe our lives today in London. We're in a hurry, we're rushing from one thing to the next all the time, and we're not really fully doing anything with the whole of ourselves all the time. So Bhante says, the consequence of this is that we don't get very far, we don't grow, and we don't develop. So that would feel quite difficult, wouldn't it? It'd be a difficult thing to take on board if there wasn't an alternative. But there quite clearly is an alternative. Well, maybe it's not quite clear to all of you yet, but hopefully I'm going to make it clear. So this thing of us being divided, of us kind of being divided in our aims, not fully doing things, not being fully attentive, does that speak to you all? Does that resonate with you? Yeah, okay, that's good to hear. So it's not good that obviously that's the case. I'm hopefully going to get you all to the point of stream entry by the end of this evening. But it's not good that it's the case, but it's good that it resonates. When I was thinking about talking about this, there was something that came to my mind, which was that I was on retreat recently. So Manjusir was talking about the value of going on retreat, and I go on retreat regularly, and I usually do a solitary retreat once a year, and I've only been back about 3 or 4 weeks from a 3-week solitary retreat that I did. So I did a retreat for 3 weeks where I was just completely on my own, and I was in a stone cabin in the mountains in southern Spain, basically, just for 3 weeks. Just meditating, doing a bit of study, going for walks, that sort of thing. 3 weeks of complete solitude. And it's a very interesting experience doing a solitary retreat. I mean, it's not something that we talk about a lot here, but if you've been meditating for a while and you've been on a few retreats, I highly recommend going on a solitary retreat. It's an extremely interesting experience. And part of why it's very interesting is because you completely meet yourself when you do a solitary retreat. I mean, you've got no other distractions. There's no other retreatants. You completely set your own program, so there's nothing that you have to do. I mean, I did have a rough program that I was following, but it was interesting. At a certain point, I was just meeting my resistance, basically, especially for the first few days. I was meeting quite a lot of resistance, and that's unusual for me. I normally just really enjoy solitary retreats. And I sort of sail through them, but I was meeting quite a lot of resistance on this retreat. At a certain point, I was there and I was thinking, it's so funny, just on my own there, and I was thinking, oh, God, I've had breakfast now, I've got to wash up, then I've got to, so it's like, and then I thought, you don't have to do anything. There is literally nothing that you have to do. You're only doing what you want. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because often in life we can think, I have to do this and I have to go to work and da-da-da. And, in a sense that's true. But in another sense, actually, we choose to do those things largely. But this was a real stark example because, you don't have to do anything. You could just sit in a chair all day, But still I'm like, I have to wash up, And then there was another point as well where I was about 3 or 4 days into the retreat and I just could not get this earworm out of my head. So I don't know if other people experience this on retreat, but I'm terrible for it because I listen to a lot of music and I've been obsessed with music from an early age, and music sticks in my mind very easily. if I could remember the Dharma the way I can remember random song lyrics from 1982, I'd definitely be enlightened by now. It just sticks in a way that the Dharma doesn't, And I'd been in a coffee shop in Alicante, which was the nearest town to the retreat. And I'd gone into this lovely coffee shop and I'd sat there. They did really nice flat whites, and there was a lovely boxer dog there, and I was chatting to him. And and I was sat there having my coffee, and this song played. And then on the retreat for the first 4 or 5 days, I just couldn't get it out of my head, So some of you, I'm going to show my age here, but Blondie, people remember Blondie? So they had 7 top 10 hits between 1977 and 1982, including Atomic, Tide is High, Sunday Girl, Denis, Rapture. And on this retreat, but they had a comeback single in 1999. And I don't know if people remember the comeback single, Maria, you gotta see her, like that. And this song was going round and round and round my head. And then what was even worse is that I started making a football chant out of it. And I don't even like football. That's the really weird thing. So I sat there trying to meditate, and round and round my head I was going, Marino, Jose Marino. And I don't even like football. Like, really, And this is the thing. So I'd chosen to be there. I was trying to meditate, and and what was happening is basically there's part of me that still wanted to be in the cafe in Alicante sipping a flat white. I'm not completely there. I'm not completely present. Thankfully, that didn't carry on for the whole retreat. That sort of abated after about the first 3 or 4 days. It wasn't all like that, but there was a bit of that. And then it's interesting, when we are able to fully attend, something else arises. Any retreat, I think, is interesting, and a solitary retreat is interesting because sometimes it's about putting yourself in the right conditions. Sometimes we need to actively work with our mind to try and just be more focused. And sometimes it's just about putting yourself in conditions where that division can just slowly fall away. And this is definitely what happened with me on this retreat. So by the second week, I was just completely in the flow of the retreat and really loving being there, really appreciating it, feeling very, very blissful, really enjoying studying the Dharma, all of these things. But definitely there was that sense of kind of division earlier on in the week, or earlier on in the retreat. And I think also what Bhante means when he talks about superficiality and he talks about divided aims is that sometimes what we do, and I think this is particularly true when we first come along. I think it's true up until the point where we break this fetter, but it's true right up until that point, is that often what we can be doing is things that just directly contradict each other. So this was very, very true of me in my early days of involvement in Buddhism. So I was very young when I came to Buddhism, and I would kind of go to the Buddhist Centre once or twice a week, and I would meditate in the morning, and then I'd go out and drink heavily in the evenings and kind of take drugs at the weekend and that sort of thing. And so it's almost like what I was doing was directly opposed. I'd be getting up early in the morning to meditate, and then I'd be completely sort of wiping that out, And it's interesting just thinking about whether we do that or whether we do a sort of a version of that, that there's part of us that's behind it, but we've got this habit, or we've got this these kind of volitions in our lives that are sort of hanging on. And this is the way Bhante describes it. So he says that it's like there's part of us is forging ahead, and then there's part of us is basically just hanging back and not quite sure. So it means that to some degree what we're doing is kind of going through the motions. So we're not fully present, we're not fully in what we're doing, and it also means that we don't quite get the significance of what it is that we're actually trying to do. We don't actually quite get the teachings. And I think this is key to understanding this concept, is that the reason why often we don't fully engage is that we don't realize that actually the path is not the practice. So the path is actually us. What we're trying to do is change ourselves. So what we're trying to do is actually become a different being. And the practices are there to support us doing that, but the practices are they're a means, they're not an end in themselves. So just turning up to a puja, for example, or just turning up to the class, or just turning up to meditation is not going to be enough in and of itself to change us. It's like we have to get the significance of the fact that what we're trying to do is change ourselves. It's not enough just to engage superficially with the practice. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. Because when we do that and when we get that, it makes us approach things in a different way. When we realize that actually it's not just enough to participate, it means that we bring a degree of awareness and a degree of mindfulness to the practice, because we know that what we're trying to do is actually change ourselves. So what we then do is we look at, well, who are we now? What's going on? What do we need to do? What do we need to change to make progress? What is it that we actually need to address? And I think this is significant in terms of the context that Bhante gave the lecture in. So the introduction to this book is quite interesting. So it's a member of our order, and he's talking about the atmosphere in some talks that Bhante gave in the mid-1970s. Now, Bhante actually gave this lecture in 1980, but the 70s and sort of up to 1980 and maybe a little bit beyond were kind of the end of a particular era in British Buddhism. So Sangharakshita had been a wandering monk in India for a long time, about 20 years or something like that. And he had led this completely immersive life. From a very young age, Sangharakshita gave himself unequivocally to the Buddhist path, practiced it very, very fully. But when he came back to the UK and started to teach in the UK and started to speak to people in the UK, he was very, very disappointed with what he found. And the primary thing that he was disappointed in is that how Buddhism was taught in the UK at that time was very much in an atmosphere of something like a cross between a hobby and an academic study. So there was the Buddhist Society, and there was these kind of like events where people would go along and they would listen to these talks, but it wasn't necessarily fully kind of embedded in their life. It was, like I said, something like an academic interest or a hobby. And Bhante was very, very strong on the fact that, and this is true, that actually for the teachings to really have an effect on us, well, it's like Manjushri was saying early in the first half. He was saying that, we need to really embed these things in our, well, he used the phrase in our spiritual life. I mean, I would say actually just in our life. To really feel this taste of freedom fully, or to get to the level of breaking this fetter, and really, really tasting vimutti, really tasting freedom, we need to give our lives, essentially. We need to give more and more of our lives to the teachings, and we need to embed the teachings more and more in our life. And the more of ourselves we give, then the more effective the teachings will be. It's not enough just to have a passing or a casual interest. So this breaking this fetter is actually like a total transformation. So what's required to break this fetter is it's interesting. Bhante talks about this in the lecture. What's required is commitment. And I find this very, very interesting. So in the lecture he talks about this, and he talks about it in terms of when the fetter is broken, what arises is commitment. But it's also true that what is needed to break the fetter is commitment. And I find that very, very interesting. So it's both. So we need to make a commitment at whatever level we're at, but ultimately vimutti is a sense of commitment And it's a sense of just being able to give ourselves completely. So even at our level, I think we can have glimpses that something else is possible. We can have moments where, I don't know, maybe in meditation, or maybe on a retreat, or maybe we've been inspired by something that we've heard in the Buddha's teaching, and there can be like an opening, and that's like a moment of inspiration, isn't it? Where we see things just slightly differently for that time. So even at our level, we can have that. And I would imagine that to some degree we've all had that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't keep coming back week after week. So at the sort of ultimate level of this taste of freedom, of tasting vimutti, that arises on the basis of a very, very strong vision experience. So as Jnanavacha mentioned last week, that arises on the basis of a stage of the path called knowledge and vision of things as they really are. So seeing things very, very differently. And freedom arises on the basis of that. But even at our level, whatever level we're practicing at, we can have a taste of that vision. We can have a taste of the fact that something can be different. We can have a slight taste of like an opening or a sense of freedom or a sense of joy. And on the basis of that, we can make a commitment. So I had this experience when I first came along here. So as I said, I'd been practicing Buddhism for quite some time, but I'd kind of fallen away from the path, really. I was still meditating and calling myself a Buddhist, but I wasn't involved for a long time, for about 7 or 8 years, with a particular Buddhist community. And when I came along here, on the second or third night I think I came along, there was a teacher called Maitreya Bandhu that some of you might know, and he was doing a series called Cultivating Insight. And I was sat there, he was teaching, and he was talking, and it was like as he was talking, it just resonated so strongly with me. It was like it had an effect on my consciousness just listening to him. And on the basis of that, I decided, okay, I'm going to keep coming along to this class every week. So I made a commitment on the basis of that. I thought, this is something that I want to investigate. This is something that I want to look further into. So even just on that small level, there was like an opening and then a commitment. So commitment is the fruit of the path, and it's also the way as well. And I think it's important because by definition, if we're practicing Buddhism, we are trying to, there'd be no point in doing that if we felt we were perfect as we were. Yeah? We're trying to get beyond where we are now. We're trying to get to somewhere else. We might not know what that somewhere else looks like, but we have a sense that something else is possible, and we're trying to move towards it. But because we're not there yet, there's a journey between where we are now and where we're trying to get to. And there will be parts of us that resist that. So there'll be a part of us that is very, very happy where we are now. Thank you very much. I'm not up for budging. That's what's likely to... Well, that is what is going to happen, actually. And yeah, I had a sense of this particularly recently on the retreat that I did, the solitary retreat. So there would be days where I was feeling extremely blissful, extremely open, felt completely in the flow of things, and then sometimes there'd be a bit of a shutting down. There's part of me that is, okay, that's enough, thank you very much. It's not a straight linear path that we're treading, and there'll be parts of us that resist. So because there are parts of us that resist, because we're going to come up against our sort of rough edges, we need to make a commitment, basically. So if we're serious about doing this, we need to make a commitment, because otherwise what will happen is we're unlikely to see it through. We'll meet resistance and we'll either sort of give up, or it'll get too rocky, or, as Jnanavacha was saying last week, we'll just forget. Okay, so maybe I'll pause there for a moment and just see if people have got questions or anything I've said so far needs to be clarified. Yeah. Danny?
Well, I guess just like questions around what do you do if like you bump against resistance?
Yeah.
Like how do you approach it?
Yeah. God, that's a big question. I'm not sure I have the right answer to that question, to be honest. I'll just tell you what I do. I run away screaming. No, that's. I think the important thing is. Is to acknowledge what's happening. If you're able to see what's happening, I think that's really key. So I think if you're experiencing some sort of resistance and you're aware that you're experiencing resistance, that's kind of half or more of the battle, so to speak, to use a metaphor. So I think if you can be aware of what's going on and be aware that it's part of the process of growth, I think that is a large part of it in itself. And I think usually what I find is if I continue to practice with that awareness and with that awareness of what's happening and with that awareness that it's part of the path, actually what I find is I tend to get quite excited about it now. I view it as quite positive. So it's painful, but it's positive. So I won't go into detail because there isn't much time, but on this retreat that I was on recently, I had kind of resistance and also some quite painful things coming up in my experience, which were around my ethical life going back some years. And I saw some of the ways that I'd been and some of the ways that I treated people, and that felt quite painful to me. But with the years of experience that I've been practicing, actually I felt that it was actually quite positive what was happening. And often when we meet resistance, it is quite positive. It just doesn't always feel easy, if that makes sense. Like it's part of the path of change, is that you are going to meet resistance. I think anything worth doing, you are going to meet resistance at some point. That's not even just true of Dharma practice. I think it's true of learning to write, learning to play a musical instrument, parenthood, or So I think that can be applied to the Buddhist path, but it's true of all sorts of things actually. And I think that's why commitment is extremely important as well. So for me, I often just fall back on my commitment so that I sit in awareness, and I also think, okay, well this is what I've chosen to do. This is the commitment that I've made. Is that helpful? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah.
You mentioned the superficiality.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing that could happen in other religions, certainly in Christianity.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm needing to get a link with heart-mind, really, because, it's like to overcome that, it would appear to me there needs to be, it's very easy to be intellectually fascinated, isn't it? And
yeah,
not have the
that's right. That's
so
right.
It's hard to get the two together.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
So can you say something about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very, very good point, because it's interesting, isn't it, that in Buddhism we have this word chitta, which means heart-mind. And I think what Bante's pointing to is that, like you say, we want to bring those two things together. And I'm going to say a bit more about it in a moment, but just briefly to say, Bante has this lovely aphorism that I think is so true and so helpful, where he says that we need to find emotional equivalents to our intellectual understandings. We need to get our emotions behind the decisions that we've made. And I think to do that, we need to be honest with ourselves about what it is that we're actually interested in, or what it is that really actually stirs us. It's not good enough, or it's not going to work actually, just to think that to do something just because you think it's a good idea. What is it that actually, what is it that moves us? So that might be, outside of our Buddhist practice, or it might be in our Buddhist practice, and maybe even finding some way of bringing those things together. So for me, it was around aesthetic practice, and also just other people. So, for example, meditation, is an area of my practice that sort of lags behind everything else. It's not about meditation for me. Although I do have quite a satisfying meditation practice these days, that wasn't the case for years. And for me, what I found when I came along is I really love taking part in Buddhist ritual. And also, I've just always been very, very interested in friendships and community. And that was what drew me in. And I sort of used that as a focus, really. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves about where we're at. And I think we also need to find out what it is that really sparks us off. And then sort of investigate that in the context of commitment. That's helpful. Okay. So I'm going to say a few things now, and I'm just going to make a few points about commitment. So I'm calling this a little subsection called Suggestions for Successful and Effective Commitment. So the first thing that I would say is I like talking about this. I think commitment's really, really important. And I think the first thing I would say is commit when you're inspired. So commit from the best and highest part of you. And it's a bit like what I was saying before. Commit on the basis of vision. And if you have that experience of feeling inspired, and you have that experience of feeling somehow open or in tune, that's really precious. So commit on the basis of that. Make a commitment on the basis of that. And I'll say what that might mean in a moment, what that commitment might look like. But as I said before, it's no good just thinking, it's no good committing to something just because you think it's a good idea, basically. Your heart has to be behind it. So if you feel somehow inspired, make a commitment on the basis of that. Subhuti talks about this. So Subhuti's a senior member of our order, very, very wonderful teacher. He visits the London Buddhist Centre regularly, and he talks about that in a book of his called Mind and Harmony that I was studying on my solitary retreat. And he's saying, look, if you don't do that, if your heart's not behind it, it's just not going to work, basically. You know, you might think it's a good idea to get up and meditate every day at 5 o'clock in the morning. But if your heart's not really behind it, you'll probably get up at 5 o'clock the next morning, then you'll get up at 6 o'clock the next morning, and then by Thursday you just won't get up at all, and then you just won't want to meditate, you know. So really commit on the basis of feeling inspired, but also commit on the basis of something that you can actually do, something that you will do and that you can do. And I would also say commit to something bigger than you are. So this is what I've been talking about, isn't it? We can only commit to something that inspires us. And actually, if it's not bigger than we are, then it's not really a commitment, because we're not really actually going to go anywhere or change or do anything. So find something that you respond to that is bigger than you are, that is going to call for you to change in some way. I wonder if I need to say a bit more about that. No, maybe I'll leave that for the moment. And then the other thing I would say is if you're making a commitment, talk about it, or maybe even make it public. So making a public commitment is very, very, very strong. So I've obviously made a lot of public commitments. So, I became a mitra, I asked for ordination, I've been ordained, all sorts of things like that, which are making a public commitment. But in a sense, any formal commitment is actually a public commitment. So, like becoming a mitra, for example, which is a public commitment, it's you do that publicly, and also it's in the sense then that people know that you've made that commitment as well. And when people know that you've made a certain commitment, they'll expect you to live up to it, or they'll expect you to try to live up to it at least. And I think that's why making a public commitment is so incredibly, it's very moving for a start, when you say to everybody, okay, I'm so behind this that I'm prepared to publicly say what it is that I'm doing. And it's also very, very helpful because you know that people are expecting you to try to live up to that commitment. It's interesting, I was just chatting with somebody at the tea break just now about ordination. And I was saying that at ordination you're given a new name. So I was given a new name at ordination, Akashamitra, and I really love my name, and I feel like it's a teaching, and I also feel like it's a constant reminder to me. So I use my name pretty much all the time, and the fact that I have this Buddhist name means that whenever anyone meets me, it's like I'm reminding myself, and it's also a sort of a public declaration of who I am, because a lot of the time people ask, where did your name come from and what does it mean and so on. And that's not, it's not always easy. Whatever we're doing, at whatever level we're doing it, it's not always easy. But if we've made a commitment, it makes it a bit easier. I remember my first public outing with my name, which was, hadn't been ordained very long. I'd been ordained about 2 weeks, and I'd mainly just been hanging out with Buddhists for those 2 weeks. And then I went to a friend's wedding, and it was like me and my partner, who's a Buddhist, and no other Buddhists there, and some people know me and they knew that I'd been ordained and that sort of thing, but a lot of people didn't. And it was the first time I'd been out in public with my new name, and I literally met like 10, 12 people where they were just going, "What? Sorry, your name's what? Okay, can I shorten it?" I was, "No, you can't shorten it." "Okay, well, can I just call you Aki?" It was like, "No, you can't call me Aki either." And I remember thinking like, "Oh goodness, this is really not going to be easy at all." And then the next person I met, they just said, "Oh goodness me, what a beautiful name. I've always been interested in Buddhism. Do you mind if I talk to you a bit more about it?" And that's, I don't know what I'm trying to say with that, but it's a good story. But yeah, it's that thing, isn't it? Of we're committed to something. So we're committed to something, so we see it through, even if it's challenging, even if it's difficult. So then the other thing I would say about commitment is, if you feel inspired and you're not sure about whether to make a commitment, I always say that a really good way to decide whether to make a commitment or not is to look at people who've made that commitment and decide whether you want to become like them. So that's what happened to me when I came along here, was I met people like Jnanavacha, Maitreya Bandhu, and I thought, yeah, okay, if that's what years of practice do for you, I'm interested in that. Sign me up. Look at people who've been practicing. Look at people who've made a commitment, and see if actually that's something that you aspire to. I was teaching here a couple of years ago. I was telling a story about a band that I was very into when I was in my teens and early 20s, called The Hypnotics, and these guys were my heroes at the time. I absolutely loved them. And I thought they were so cool, like really skinny and great looking, and, just looked amazing. They were fantastic. And then I went to see them reformed a couple of years ago, and it was a shock to the system. Like, one of them just looked like he hadn't stopped taking drugs since those years. And by the time you get to my age and a bit older, like, that doesn't wear very well, And I was looking, thinking, okay, like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And I was, I felt quite sad in a way, actually. And I don't want to sort of make light of the situation or sort of make fun in a way, but it was almost like, okay, well, that's what I believed in when I was young, and if you follow that, basically that's where it ends up. And if you're interested in following something and committing yourself to something, look at people and see where it ends up, basically. And then the last thing I would say on commitment is, don't wait to be 100% sure. So if you're not sure about making a commitment, and you're not making a commitment because you're not sure, what I would say to you is, you can't be sure. You can't ever be 100% sure of anything, ever, probably until the point of enlightenment. So we can't be sure of anything, can we? I've had conversations with people a few times where they've said, look, I'm thinking of taking this more seriously. I don't know, I'm not sure. And that's always my answer is, well, you can't be sure. You don't know how things are going to end up. What you need to be is sure enough. So this path isn't perfect, and the people who practice it aren't perfect. You're always going to run into difficulties. But if you're sure enough, then sure enough is sure enough. You're never going to be 100% sure. Okay, so you could say, as I said, that commitment is both fruit and path. So it's the way and the goal. So Bhante talks about it as this state of vimutti is a state of commitment, but it's also what gets us there. We don't need to be sure to get that. We don't need to make a total commitment to make some progress, to move towards total commitment with the level that we're at the moment. We just need to make enough commitment to get us beyond where we are now. So Bhante talks about the Buddhist life as being a committed life. I can't remember where he talks about that. Can you remember, Manjusir? I think it might be in What is the Dharma, another book that he, some transcribed lectures in book form. But he describes the Buddhist life as a committed life. But it's interesting, I think commitment is a habit. It's something that we do. It's not something that's fixed. It's something that can be changed. So I think for us, I feel this for me, is that rather than thinking about a committed life, it's actually probably more useful to think about doing things which require commitment. So that's probably a more helpful way of thinking about it, is to get to ultimate commitment. What we need to do is just do things that require commitment. And I think that that is actually just a beautiful way to be as a human being, even regardless of being a Buddhist. I've come across people in my life many people in my life, who live in that way. They're not afraid of doing something that requires commitment. They're not afraid of doing things that are going to be difficult or challenging. If we only live our lives for pleasure or fun, it's a very, very shallow existence. It's a very superficial existence, as Bhante would put it. If we're not afraid of commitment, if we're not afraid of standing in our values and being prepared to undergo challenge and to see that through, then that's a very, very beautiful, enriching way to live our life, I think. And what we need to do is we need to get enough of ourselves behind that. At our level, whatever level we're at, we need to get enough of ourselves behind that so that we can make the next commitment for us. So what I'd invite you to do, I was going to do this in pairs, there's not quite enough time, but what I'd invite you to do this evening is when you leave, is think about what would be a commitment for you that is going to enrich your life in some way. It could be something to do with coming here, so it could be committing to coming to a weekly class, it could be committing to a course, it could be committing to going on retreat, it could be even thinking of becoming a mitra or making a public commitment. But think about a commitment that you could make, or maybe even more than one commitment. Think about what that is and make that commitment. Make that commitment which will enrich your life and see it through. And maybe you could even talk to somebody else about it. Start that habit of commitment. Start to make those commitments that add up to a committed life. And even then, I wonder whether we actually fully get the significance of that. So we talk about this thing of commitment, and actually in the Buddhist sense, so in the sense of vimutti, probably we just think about it on our own level. It's very interesting, isn't it? What we tend to do is we look at things in terms of what we already know. It's very hard for us to imagine something that is much, much more lofty and more beautiful. Had an experience of this on my retreat where I realized that I was doing this with some ants. And I was walking back. I went to this place one day for a walk, just went down into the next valley, and I walked back and I was watching these ants because there's not much to do on retreat, so you're a bit hard up for entertainment. And I was watching these ants for a bit, and I realized that what I was doing was I was looking at these ants and I was thinking that somehow they were a bit like me. Like they were going, all right, Gov, where do you want this piece of apple then, And I'm going, oh, God, I'm really fed up with this. I've got to pull this bit of grass. And I thought, no, that's not what it's like for an ant. An ant has a completely different form of consciousness. They're not like us. It reminded me of, anybody used to watch The Young Ones, the comedy series, The Young Ones? Yeah, I'm slightly showing my age again, but there's a scene in that where they're sat in the garden, and Mike says to Vivian, what is it he says? He says, do you think ants go to discos? And Vivian says, look, it's proven that ants are highly intelligent creatures with a very well-ordered society. And then he says back to him, why is that one wearing a silver boob tube then? And they look down and there's this ant kind of dancing and stuff like that. And he starts talking and it's, like a human ant sort of thing. And it's funny because obviously that isn't the case, is it? Ants are actually different from us. But what we tend to do is we just look and we think that everything is the same as us. I can't remember what I was talking about now. But yes, that's right. So when we think of commitment, we tend to think of commitment at our level. But in terms of vimutti, it's not like that. And I think it's much more helpful to think of it like this. So this is what it looks like in sort of poetic, artistic form. And I absolutely love this image. This image of the Dakini, which we've had on the shrine for the last few weeks. And I think it's great that image is on the shrine. And I think it's a beautiful poetic evocation of what that freedom and what that commitment actually tastes like. So the Dakini's there, and the Dakini is holding this skull cup, yeah? And she hasn't got her phone in the other hand. She's not thinking like, oh, I tell you, I'll just take a quick selfie because this looks really good, or I'll just Instagram it. No, like the Dakini is completely, totally in that experience, and that experience is fierce and full and incredible and is way beyond what we can imagine. I love this image. The first time I came across the image of a Dakini, I realized that it's not the first time I'd seen somebody drinking out of a skull cap. So I actually met somebody in real life doing this once in Varanasi. I don't know if anybody's been to Varanasi in India. It's a crazy place. It's absolutely bonkers. I was there for the first time like nearly 20 years ago when I was a young man. And I went down to the Ghats, which is the place where they burn the dead bodies, basically. And I met this guy called Kamal. And he was like crazy looking guy with these massive long dreadlocks. And I got talking to him. And as I was talking to him, he went down and he reached up and he had this skull cap. And it was full of water. And he was crumbling this stuff into it called bhang, which is like incredibly strong marijuana. And then he proceeded to like drink out of this skull cap. Crazy guy. Very, very, very attractive though. Like there's really, really far out energy that he had. And I went back to find him the next day and he wasn't there. And in some ways I was quite pleased that he wasn't there. I just thought I'd buy him lunch, And he wasn't there. And then all sorts of stuff happened to me in Varanasi after that, which I don't have time to go into. But so she's holding this skull cap and she's got a necklace of skulls around her neck. And she's drinking the nectar, so this nectar of enlightenment, basically. And she's completely free, so she can move in any direction because that consciousness, there is no consciousness there like ours. So there is nothing. We can look at this and we can think what it would be like to be in that situation, but there is nothing that resembles our consciousness there. There's no I there. There's no self-referential consciousness. There's just freedom, just total freedom and bliss and creativity. And we can't imagine what that's like, but we can get a taste of a taste of a taste of it. And on the basis of that taste, we can make a commitment which will take us a little bit closer to that. And it's then that when we really, really get to that point of vimutti, it's then that we experience true commitment, and it's then that we really start to taste freedom in the sense that Bhante talked about it. So not freedom in the sense of vimutti, not vimutti in the sense of freedom, but vimutti in the sense of vimutti. So that's what we'll start to taste. Okay, so I'll leave it there for this evening.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you